Boston Harbor, 1874. The city still slept beneath a heavy blanket of fog that rolled in from the Atlantic, swallowing the piers, the warehouses, and the tall silhouettes of ships moored along the wharves. It was just before dawn when Patrick O'Rourke, a dock worker finishing a long night's shift, noticed something strange drifting between the timbers of the pier. At first, he thought it was just another piece of cargo that had broken loose from a ship. A burlap sack, perhaps, or a crate shattered by rough handling. But as he leaned over the rail, the fog shifted, and he realized it was not cargo at all. It was a body. Face down, bobbing against the wooden pilings, its pale hands outstretched as if reaching for something it would never grasp. Patrick froze, unable to move. The air smelled of salt and rotting fish, but now another stench mingled with it, coppery, sharp, unmistakable. Blood. He shouted for help. Within minutes, other dock hands gathered, their boots thudding against the wet planks as they dragged the body ashore. The gulls screamed overhead, circling hungrily. When the figure was turned over, the men recoiled. The corpse was that of a young man, perhaps no more than 20. His face was almost serene, but his body bore marks that none of them would ever forget. Deep, precise cuts across the torso, the kind no accident could explain. The kind that spoke of deliberate hand, skilled, practiced, and cruel. By mid-morning, word had spread across the waterfront. Dock workers, sailors, and fishmongers muttered in hushed tones, glancing nervously over their shoulders as they went about their business. Some whispered of a drunken brawl gone too far. Others suggested it was the work of foreign sailors, known to come and go under the cover of darkness. But a few, those who had seen the wounds for themselves, began to murmur a different theory. There was someone hunting along the docks, someone who knew how to kill. The newspapers would not yet seize upon the story, but among the men who toiled. Along the harbor, fear began to take root. Boston's waterfront was a place of commerce, of endless activity, but it was also a place of shadows. The alleys behind the warehouses stretched like veins into the city's underbelly, and the fog could conceal anything: a thief, a drunk, or perhaps something far worse. As night fell again on the harbor, few men were willing to walk alone. Some carried knives tucked into their belts. Others clutched rosaries, muttering prayers under their breath. In the taverns that lined the wharves, stories began to spread of strange figures seen on the piers after midnight, tall shadows lingering too long near the water's edge, footsteps echoing when no one was there. It was during one of these whispered exchanges that a name first surfaced, a name spoken with unease, as though saying it aloud might summon him from the mist. Elias Thornwood, a butcher by trade, a man some claimed worked odd hours, appearing on the docks long after the ships had gone quiet. He was said to carry his tools with him wherever he went, long knives wrapped in oilcloth, sharpened to a gleam. Most dismissed the rumors as drunken talk, nothing more. But others swore they had seen him wandering the fog, his heavy boots leaving prints that vanished into the darkness. Still, no one knew the truth. Was Elias Thornwood truly the man responsible? Or was he just another laborer caught in the crosscurrents of suspicion and fear? What was certain was this: Boston's harbor had become a hunting ground, and the killer, whoever he was only just beginning. The body found that morning was not the last. It was the first in a series of horrors that would grip the city and earn one man a name that would echo in its darkest history: the butcher of Boston's docks. To understand the fear that gripped Boston in the autumn of 1874, one must first step back into the city itself, into its streets, its docks, and the people who lived and labored there. Boston in the late 19th century was a city in transition. The Industrial Revolution had swelled its population, and the harbor was its beating heart. Ships from Europe and the American South arrived daily, unloading cargoes of coal, cotton, fish, and timber. Alongside the goods came men and women immigrants seeking work, families chasing opportunity, and others simply trying to survive. The docks were a place of constant noise. Wooden planks groaned under the weight of crates and barrels. Iron chains rattled as cargo swung from ship to shore, and voices in Irish, Italian, and English mingled with the cries of gulls overhead. The air was thick with the tang of salt, the musk of tar, and the ever-present stench of fish. Yet beneath the commerce lay desperation. The men who unloaded the ships worked for meager wages, often competing fiercely for day labor. A single, missed shift could mean a family went hungry. In this environment, shadows thrived. The fog that rolled in from the Atlantic was more than weather. It was a cloak. After sundown, the harbor transformed into a labyrinth of dim alleys, shuttered warehouses, and creaking ships where the difference between a drunken stumble and a predator's approach could be impossible to tell. Police patrols rarely ventured into these neighborhoods at night. The docks were seen as rough ground, a world apart from the genteel streets of Beacon Hill or the growing commercial districts of downtown. For the working poor who lived there, protection was something they had to provide for themselves. It was within this environment that Elias Thornwood moved, a figure known yet not fully understood. He had been born to a family of butchers, apprenticed in the trade from the time he could hold a cleaver. By the time he was a man, Elias had developed a reputation for his skill with a knife. His cuts were clean, his knowledge of animal anatomy precise. Customers at the small shop where he occasionally worked described him as quiet, his voice low, his eyes cold and watchful. He was not unkind, but there was something about him, a heaviness in his presence, a lack of warmth that left people uneasy. Unlike most men who worked the trade, Elias did not seem to seek company. He had no wife, no children, and no close friends. He was often seen wandering the docks at odd hours, long after the last tavern had emptied. Some said he simply enjoyed the solitude. Others whispered that he was searching for something, or someone. But Elias was not the only figure in this story. The victims who would later fall into his path were drawn from the same struggling world. Young Irish immigrants, barely into manhood, who shouldered heavy loads on their backs until their muscles ached. Italian women cleaning boarding houses for pennies, dreaming of better lives for their children. Children themselves, newsboys, errand runners, orphans, who darted between wagons and ships trying to earn a few coins before night fell. These were the people who lived closest to the edge, the ones least likely to be missed by the powerful, and therefore the ones most vulnerable when darkness came. The social tensions of the time only made matters worse. Boston's established Yankee elite often looked down on the wave of Irish and Italian newcomers, blaming them for crime, poverty, and disease. Police forces, largely drawn from political appointments, were overstretched and often uninterested in crimes committed among the poor. A dock worker gone missing might be written off as a man who had drunk too much and vanished into another city. A maid who failed to return to her boarding house could be dismissed as having run off with a sailor. Was this indifference that allowed the whispers to grow unchecked? Strange sounds heard in the fog. A scream cut short near the warehouses, a trail of blood vanishing into the harbor. Each story on its own might have been dismissed as rumor, but together they painted a picture of something darker brewing on the docks. And in the middle of it, silent and watchful, was Elias Thornwood the butcher, whose reputation, though vague and uncertain, was beginning to stir unease. Boston's waterfront was a world balanced on the edge of survival, and it was within this fragile, chaotic space that a predator found room to hunt. The stage was set, the fog was thick, and the city was not yet ready for what was coming. The first body found in the harbor might have been dismissed as misfortune, a drunken fall, a quarrel gone too far had it not been followed by another. And then another. By the winter of 1874, Boston's docks were no longer just a place of labor. They had become the stage for a series of killings that defied explanation and instilled dread in every man, woman, and child who lived nearby. The second victim was Mary Donnelly, a maid who lived in a boarding house on Commercial Street. She was 22 years old, recently arrived from County Cork, Ireland, and was known among her neighbors for her laughter, quick and bright, that carried down the narrow stairwells of the tenement where she rented a small room. One night, after finishing her chores at the boarding house, she stepped out to fetch water from a pump not far from the waterfront. She never returned. 2 days later, her body was found wedged between pilings near a fish market. The fishermen who discovered her swore they would never forget the sight. Her dress was torn, her body marked by cuts far too deliberate to be explained by accident. The papers would not print the details, but those who saw whispered that her injuries looked more like the work of a surgeon than of a common thug. The precision unsettled even hardened dockhands who had seen their share of violence. The killings continued. A boy named Samuel Finch, no more than 14, vanished after selling newspapers along Atlantic Avenue. His disappearance at first caused little alarm. Children of the docks often ran away or shifted from one corner of the city to another. But Samuel's small bundle of papers was later discovered abandoned by the water, his cap floating beside it. When his body was recovered days later, it bore the same marks that had been found on the others. Fear spread quickly. Dock workers refused to walk home alone at night, often banding together in groups carrying lanterns and makeshift weapons. Women hurried from work before the sun dipped too low, locking their doors and shuttering their windows once darkness fell. The taverns buzzed with talk of a killer who stalked the fog, slipping through alleys with a butcher's blade in hand. Patterns began to emerge. The victims were always last seen near the docks after nightfall. Their wounds bore similarities that suggested not rage but calculation. The cuts were made with knowledge, almost as though the killer was dissecting, rather than simply killing. To some, it seemed impossible that any ordinary dockside criminal could carry out such acts. To others, the explanation was clear. Only a butcher, a man accustomed to carving flesh with speed and precision, could have been responsible. Whispers turned once again to Elias Thornwood. He had no alibi for the nights of the murders. He was often spotted wandering the docks long after midnight, his heavy steps echoing on the wooden planks. Neighbors recalled seeing him carry heavy sacks into the fog, though none dared ask what was inside. And always he kept his tools with him, long knives, gleaming sharp, wrapped in cloth and carried beneath his coat. But suspicion alone did not bring safety. More bodies followed. A dockhand named Lorenzo Bianchi, who had left Italy to seek a better life in America, disappeared after drinking with friends one night. His remains were discovered floating near the harbor, his body ravaged by wounds too exact to be explained by random violence. A widow named Abigail Moore vanished from her rooming house. Her body was never recovered, though neighbors claimed they heard her scream echo through the fog. By early 1875, the killings had shaken Boston to its core. The newspapers could no longer ignore them. Headlines spoke of a phantom of the docks, a dockside butcher, and a harbor fiend. The city had seen violence before, but never a series of murders that seemed so cold, so purposeful, and so impossible to stop. And yet, through it all, Elias Thornwood remained a shadow. He kept working, kept walking the docks at night, his presence both ordinary and ominous. To look at him, some said, was to see nothing unusual, just another laboring man in a city filled with them. But for those who looked longer, who caught the stillness in his gaze or the way his hands lingered on the handle of a knife, there was something else, something that suggested he was not just a man of his trade. He was a man who hunted. By the time spring returned to Boston, the killings were no longer dismissed as isolated tragedies. They were a pattern, one that pointed, more and more, to a single figure. And soon the city would demand answers. By the spring of 1875, Boston's waterfront had become a place of dread. Once alive with the clamor of trade, it now fell into uneasy silence after dusk. Families begged their sons not to work night shifts, and mothers forbade their daughters from venturing near the piers at all. Even the hardened dock workers, men who had faced storms at sea and brawls in taverns, admitted they feared the fog. Something hunted there, something deliberate, and the city's authorities could no longer look away. At first, the Boston Police Department resisted the idea of a single killer. They were overworked and undertrained, their methods still rooted in instinct rather than science. Many believed the murders were isolated drunken fights, robberies gone wrong, or tragedies linked to the rough immigrant quarters. But the mounting pressure from newspapers forced their hand. The Boston Daily Globe had already given the unknown predator a name, the butcher of the docks. Each new headline stoked public outrage. Crowds gathered outside police stations demanding answers. Detectives began retracing the steps of the victims. They interviewed boarding house keepers, tavern owners, and dock foremen. Each account led them back to the same narrow world: the piers, the warehouses, and the men who worked them. Suspicion naturally fell upon the laborers themselves. Some dock gangs were notorious for violence, and sailors passing through Boston often vanished without a trace. But the precision of the killing stood apart. This was not the work of a drunken gang fight. Whoever the butcher was, he wielded his blade with skill. It was then that Elias Thornwood's name surfaced more frequently. Witnesses described him as a solitary figure, seen lingering near the water long after others had gone home. One dockhand claimed to have spotted him dragging a heavy sack into an alley on the very night Mary Donnelly disappeared. A fishmonger swore he had watched Elias wash what looked like blood from his hands in the harbor, muttering to himself under his breath. None of these accounts were conclusive, but together they began to form a troubling picture. Detectives placed Thornwood under quiet surveillance. For weeks they followed him through the fog, observing his habits. They watched him work in the butcher shop, the way his knives moved with unnerving ease, the way he seemed to lose himself in the act of cutting. They tracked him as he wandered, the alleys near the docks always alone, sometimes stopping to stare out at the black water for long stretches of time. One night, officers claimed to have seen him carrying a bundle that dripped onto the cobblestones. By the time they reached the spot, Thornwood was gone, and so was the bundle. The police knew they needed something more than whispers. In July of that year, their chance came. A dockhand named Joseph Malloy was walking home late when he heard a scuffle in the fog near a warehouse. He swore he saw a tall man wrestling with another figure, something glinting in his hand. Malloy shouted, and the assailant fled. When police arrived, they found blood on the ground and a trail that led toward the waterfront. The injured man, though gravely wounded, survived long enough to describe his attacker: broad-shouldered, silent, carrying the tools of a butcher. With that testimony, police moved swiftly. They tracked Thornwood to a boarding room he rented near the wharves. Inside, they found knives stained with blood hidden beneath his bed. His boots, caked with mud, matched prints discovered near the site of Malloy's attack. In the corner of the room, a canvas sack gave off a stench that turned even the most hardened officers pale. Inside were scraps of clothing, some still marked with blood. The arrest itself became legend. Officers cornered Thornwood in a foggy alley near Long Wharf. When they called for him to surrender, he turned slowly, a butcher's cleaver gleaming in his hand. For a moment, it seemed he might fight his way free. But though he swung once, the officers overpowered him, knocking the blade from his grasp and binding his hands in irons. The butcher of the docks had been caught, and yet, even in chains, Elias Thornwood remained unnerving. As police marched him through the streets, crowds gathered to jeer and spit at him. But Thornwood showed no anger, no shame. He only stared at the ground, his expression unreadable. Some swore he even smiled faintly, as though the attention was nothing more than what he had expected all along. For Boston, the arrest was both a relief and a new horror. The killer had a face, a name, and a place in the world. Now the city demanded to know, why had he done it, and how many had truly died at his hands? When Elias Thornwood was led into the courthouse in late 1875, the city of Boston seemed to hold its breath. Crowds pressed against the steps, straining for a glimpse of the man who had haunted their nightmares for more than a year. Some came out of anger, demanding justice for the dead. Others came out of curiosity, desperate to see whether the butcher of the docks looked like a monster or just another man. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters filled every bench, their pencils scratching furiously, eager to capture every word. Mothers of the victims sat with black veils pulled low, their grief palpable. Dock workers, who had once feared to walk the wharves at night, stood in the back, their arms crossed, their faces grim, and at the center of it all sat Elias Thornwood. He was a striking figure, not for any deformity or grotesque feature, but for his ordinariness. Broad-shouldered, pale, with dark eyes that betrayed little emotion. To the unknowing observer, he could have been any butcher, any laborer, any man drawn from the docks themselves. But as the evidence was laid out, the ordinary became sinister. Prosecutors described the gruesome pattern of killings. Mary Donnelly, Samuel Finch, Lorenzo Bianchi, and others whose names had become etched into the city's memory. They brought forth witnesses who had seen Thornwood wandering the docks late, at night dragging sacks that dripped onto the cobblestones. They displayed the knives seized from his boarding room, their edges still faintly stained. And most damning of all, they called Joseph Malloy, the man who had survived Thornwood's attack. With a trembling voice, Malloy pointed directly at the defendant, declaring him the man who had tried to end his life. The defense, of course, tried to argue otherwise. They claimed Thornwood was a solitary man, yes, but solitude was not guilt. They suggested the blood on his knives was nothing unusual for a butcher, and the scraps of clothing found in his room were merely rags. But as the trial wore on, the evidence became impossible to deny. The pattern, the precision, the sheer weight of testimony all pointed to one conclusion. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, their verdict echoed through the packed chamber: guilty. The sentence was death by hanging. Public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Outside the courthouse, crowds erupted into cheers, though others wept quietly for the lives already lost. The newspapers seized on the story with relish, publishing every detail of Thornwood's past they could unearth. Some claimed he had been abused as a child, orphaned and hardened by the brutal world of the docks. Others speculated about madness, suggesting the endless slaughter of animals in his trade had warped his mind. But none of these explanations satisfied the deeper question: why had he chosen to kill? In the weeks before his execution, Thornwood rarely spoke. Jailers described him as calm, almost eerily so, spending hours staring at the wall of his cell. When pressed about his crimes, he neither confessed nor denied them. "The harbor takes what it wants," he said once, his voice flat. "I was only its hand." On the morning of his execution, a crowd gathered at the gallows. Some came to see justice served. Others came seeking closure. Thornwood was led to the scaffold with the same strange calm that had marked his arrest. As the noose was placed around his neck, he looked out over the crowd. Witnesses swore he smiled faintly, as though amused by the spectacle. Moments later, the trapdoor opened, and the butcher of the docks was gone. But his legacy remained. For years afterward, parents in Boston warned their children not to stray near the waterfront after dark, invoking the specter of Thornwood as a cautionary tale. The murders forced the city to rethink its policing, leading to stronger patrols in immigrant neighborhoods and new efforts to bring order to the dockside. Newspapers, having fed the public's fear, continued to profit from lurid crime stories, cementing the rise of sensationalist reporting in America. And yet not all questions were answered. Some whispered that Thornwood had not acted alone, that others had disappeared in ways never tied to his hand. Others wondered if all the bodies had ever been found, or if the harbor still kept some of his secrets in its dark waters. History would remember Elias Thornwood as the butcher of Boston's docks. But whether he was the embodiment of one man's madness or the inevitable product of poverty, isolation, and neglect remains a question that lingers like the fog that once cloaked his crimes.